Today we head into East Tennessee to tell the story of a group of women who organized into the only all-women cavalry unit in the Civil War. While their unit started as a way to show their husbands and sweethearts serving in the Confederate cavalry their love and support, they eventually became an important part of the war effort in Rhea County. Join us as we tell the story of the Rhea County Spartans, another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Let's clarify that, Steve. Now, this is not a football team by any chance. You hear that term, the Rhea County Spartans, you might think it's a football team. And we're not going to have scores or anything having to do with that particular thing, but we're going to talk about something that really, for a lot of people, some do not understand what the woman's role was during the Civil War. Now, I've been to a couple of reenactments my son had been in at one time, and really the woman's place was to sit over to the side and picnic and have the family while they watched, the battle going on, wherever it might be. And then, of course, tend to wounds and different things like that. But this group of women had some spunk about them, didn't they?
Well, they did. And don't get the idea that these women went into battle. They didn't do that.
Right.
This was a support group of women that would ride out to their husbands and bring them fresh clothes and food and messages and all that sort of stuff. Sort of like a support group of women that giving them things they couldn't get from the army.
We could call it almost like a Confederate Red Cross if you wanted to call it that.
I think that'd be a good word for it. Sure would be. But yeah, this is down in Rhea County, and of course Rhea County being where Dayton is, and just let folks know this is the 100th anniversary of what, Rod?
The Scopes Monkey Trial.
Indeed it is, but that's not our story today. Our story is about those women down there during the Civil War. Now, a lot of folks don't realize that the eastern part of Tennessee leaned heavily toward the Union side during the Civil War. In fact, when Tennessee first voted on secession back in February 1861, the answer across the state was a loud and clear no, especially in the eastern mountains. But there were exceptions, and Rhea County in the southeast part of the state was one of them.
Well, in that first secession vote, Rhea County joined much of the rest of the state in rejecting the idea of leaving the Union. But after the fall of Fort Sumter, President Lincoln's call for the troops to put down the rebellion, well, you can guess everything changed. By June, Tennessee flipped, and so did Rhea County. Now, while most of East Tennessee stayed loyal to the Union, Rhea County threw its support behind, you guessed it, the Confederacy. Within weeks, Confederate and Union military companies were forming all over the state. Men were meeting up in town squares, electing their captains, and heading off to war. In Rhea and neighboring Meigs County, 6 companies joined the Confederacy, and an equal number went Union. Friends, neighbors, and families, you guessed it, they split. It was a civil war in the truest, most personal sense. But here's where something different happened. One group of patriotic citizens in Rhea County took things a step further. Now, these women, young, determined, fiercely Confederate, formed their own cavalry unit in support of the men that they loved who had heard the call for volunteers, saddled up, and left to defend their home. These young women called themselves the Rhea County Spartans.
Now, Rod, these women weren't play acting. They were serious. They felt a duty to contribute to the fight for what they saw as Southern independence. Many had fathers, brothers, or sweethearts already serving in Confederate ranks, and sitting on the sidelines did not sit well with them. Now, like most militaries of that time, the Confederate Army did not allow women to enlist. So what did they do? Well, they created their own independent unit, pretty much like guerrilla leaders like Confederate Champ Ferguson and Unionist Tinker Dave Beatty did. Mounted side saddle and organized with formal ranks. And they weren't nobodies either. These were daughters of Rhea County's most prominent families. Their leader, Mary McDonald, was elected captain. Her sister-in-law, Caroline McDonald, served as first lieutenant. And Rod, these women meant business.
Well, we have to understand, too, they didn't mean to go into battle. They weren't going to go in combat or anything like that, but their mission started out as a mix of morale building and material support for their loved ones serving nearby. Now, they would ride out to visit local Confederate units, bringing food, letters, and supplies. These ladies didn't engage in hand-to-hand combat in grand military campaigns, but they mattered. They helped keep the emotional bond between home and the battlefield strong. So as the war continued to drag on, the stakes got higher. In 1863, Union General Ambrose Burnside and the Ninth Corps came rolling into East Tennessee. Federal troops occupied much of the region, but the Rhea County Spartans, well, they didn't disappear. They kept meeting, often in rural churches, away from those prying eyes of those Union sympathizers.
Rod, you mentioned Ambrose Burnside.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what he's known for, other than the Civil War?
No, not right offhand, I do not.
Do you have sideburns?
Yes.
They were named after him because he had these big, long, very flowing sideburns, and instead of calling them Burnsides, they called them sideburns.
Well, you know, and some people might refer to them as mutton chops, I guess,
Yeah.
in one way, but still, I did not know that, though.
Yeah,
That's good to know. So.
Learn something new every day.
That's right.
Well, folks, there's no official record of these women's wartime activities, but based on accounts from the time, it's likely they did some spying, passing along intelligence, helping bushwhackers, or even aiding in escape routes. And that, of course, got the attention of Union authorities. Some of the women were arrested during the federal occupation, accused of espionage, but were eventually released. Still, the fact they remained active during wartime was no small act. They defied both Union soldiers and the expectations of women in their own society. By late 1864, Union forces had full control of Rhea County. One of the main units stationed there was the 6th Tennessee Mounted Infantry, a Union regiment formed in Chattanooga made up of a few Union loyalists, along with a lot of draft dodgers and deserters from the Confederacy, tasked with rooting out Confederate guerrillas.
Well, by the spring of 1865, the war was getting close to the end. But in East Tennessee, old grudges were alive and well. The Federals were in control of Rhea County, and in the chaos of war's end, some local men used their power for more than just winning the war for the Union. One of those men was Captain John Walker, an officer of the 6th Tennessee Mounted Infantry. A Rhea County native and farmer, Walker had managed to dodge Confederate conscription for years, but when Union forces gained the upper hand, he decided it was time to make a decision. He threw in his lot with the Union and began settling scores with his neighbors. Walker became known for his harsh treatment of Confederate sympathizers, real or imagined. And in his eyes, the Rhea County Spartans weren't patriotic women. They were rebels. And in April 1865, just days before Lee's surrender at Appomattox, he decided he was going to make an example of them.
On April 5th, 1865, Walker set his plan in motion. With the blessing of his superior, Lieutenant Colonel George Gowan, he ordered the arrest of the Spartans. Now, he knew exactly who they were and where to find them. He sent Lieutenant William Gothard to the town of Washington to arrest the group's leaders, Mary and Carolyn McDonald, and demanded they appear the next day at the home of William Thomason, the father of Spartan Lieutenant Rhoda Thomason. Other soldiers swept through Smith's Crossroads and Dunwoody's Mill, gathering up the remaining Spartans. Some managed to slip away, but in the end, 16 women were arrested and brought before Captain Walker.
Well, Steve, when they learned they were being sent to Chattanooga as prisoners of war, you can imagine fear set in. Mary McDonald even wrote Walker a letter begging him to let Gothard, someone they knew and trusted, escort them. But Colonel Gowan ordered Walker to take them to Chattanooga himself. The next morning, 7 of the women were marched 5 miles to Smith's Crossroads on foot, while their captors rode horseback alongside of them. At Smith's Crossroads, 6 more Spartans joined them, followed by 3 more near Bell's Landing. the full group of 16 women trudged through cold April rain, stumbling through mud puddles, soaked and absolutely miserable. When they finally reached the Tennessee River, they were forced to wait on the flooded riverbank for transport. Eventually, a small steamer, the USS Chattanooga, referred to by the locals as the Chicken Thief, arrived. It wasn't designed for passengers, nonetheless. The women were crammed into a cramped dining room on board where they collapsed in exhaustion after their long and forced march.
And Rod, when they arrived in Chattanooga, Captain Walker proudly marched his prisoners through the streets to the provost marshal's office, expecting recognition or praise. Instead, he got a dressing down from his superior, Major General James Steedman. Steedman was not impressed. He called Walker's stunt foolishness and promptly told the women to take the oath of allegiance to the Union and they'd be set free, and that they did. And just like that, their war was over. Captain Seth Moe of the Union Army then did something Walker never expected. He treated the women not like prisoners, but like honored guests. He took them to the Central House Hotel, gave them food, and let them clean up. And the Union Army picked up the tab.
They weren't as bad as some people might have made them out to be, were they, Steve?
No, they weren't.
Well, Walker had ordered to escort them safely home, but he abandoned them at the river landing. They made their way back to Rhea County alone, making the return trip on the Chicken Thief. Now, Steedman later wrote to his superiors recommending that the 6th Tennessee Mounted Infantry be disbanded and replaced, calling them worse than useless. Have you ever been called worse than useless before? I haven't, but that sounds like it's a death knell for you right there. Well, Union Colonel Lewis Merrill didn't hold back either, calling Walker's unit cowardly thieves. The war ended days later with General Robert E. Lee surrendering at Appomattox and the Rhea County Spartans disbanded. Their dreams of a Southern nation had died, and the women faded back into the roles expected of 19th century women. Most never spoke publicly about what they had done or what they endured.
Well, Rod, what about John Walker? Well, he was discharged weeks later. He managed to land a few appointments during Reconstruction, but history did not remember him kindly.
Wow, what a story. But, again, I think I said at the beginning of it, some women, and the way the reenactment was, some women would go and they would marvel at the fighting, they would look at it, bring the family, but they watched it from afar, but they treated it like a picnic dinner is what they essentially did while they were watching the war. But these women, they stood above just being the normal type of person that would go and spectate and watch the war. They wanted to get involved, but not fighting as much as taking care of their men, something they felt that they needed to do.
Yeah, I think it was as much personal as it was that call to duty, but still, they were there to support their new nation, the Confederacy, and they did it in the best way they knew how, by making sure that the men were taken care of with clothing and food, and the fact that they were there thinking about them.
Well, and it's very seldom, sometimes it's very seldom we ever get a story that the Union treated these women so nicely and with dignity, so to speak, than we do with some other instances from the war. I mean, things are different.
Well, I think part of that had to do with the fact that it was so close to being at the end, and I think everybody knew that it was coming to a close, and there was no reason to bring these women in at that point in the way that this fella did. Putting them on to the Chicken Thief, that had to indicate that was a terrible boat to be on. And then marching them down the street and threatening to put them into a prison, that just didn't sit right at that point in time in the war.
Yeah, and folks, if you think it was a cakewalk going to one of those Union prisons, think of a couple of the names of some of them. I would have hated for these women to have been sent to a place like that, but they probably would have if things had not changed.
Yeah, that is so true. Well, Rod, that's the story of the Rhea County Spartans. the only all-female cavalry company in the Civil War. And it's another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Now be sure to subscribe to the audio version of the Stories podcast if you haven't done so already. And you'll also find us on your favorite podcast app or on our YouTube channel. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.